So last term we got up to verse 9, I think, of the introduction. We're moving very slowly. I'm doing a sort of essay on each of the verses, essentially, here. And now, having done that rather rich verse, which acknowledged Maheshwara and Bhutiraja, he turns to address Somananda, Utpaladeva, and Lakshmanagupta, his predecessors in the exegesis of the Pratyabhijñā corpus of texts. Gurus of the Trayambaka lineage, which was to which he made obeisance earlier in the introduction. But in that verse, he didn't mention names. Now he explicitly mentions the names of Somananda, Utpaladeva, and Lakshmanagupta. And in fact, he does that in the next two verses, 10 and 11, and that's all I'll try to cover today. So he's turning again to those he called the pearls of the Trayambaka lineage that he addressed in the 8th verse, and this time he's naming them from Somananda to Lakshmanagupta, and by implication, rather than explicitly, adding himself to their number, as we will see. So the two verses are as follows. Shri Somananda Bodha Srimad Utpala Vinisrita Jayanti Samvida Moda Sandarbha Dikprasarpina Tada Swada Baravesha Bringhitam Mati Shatpadim Guror Lakshmanaguptasya Nada Sammohinim Numah. Jayanti, Supreme R. Perhaps I should make this point yet again. Indologists have been translating Jayati and Jayanti as victorious is or victorious are for generations now. It's a mistake. G here is used in the sense of being supreme, not defeating anybody, not having victory over anyone, just being Sarvodkrishta. So the common gloss of Jayati is Sarvodkrishto Bhavati or Sarvodkarshena Vartate, or a similar gloss. And we find this throughout Sanskrit literature. It's not just a habit of the Kashmirian exegetes, it's seen everywhere. In Buddhist, Jain, and Brahmanical literature. So Jayanti means supreme are. And what are supreme? The Samvida Moda Sandarbha, the composition, Sandarbha, the works of Shastra, Sandarbha, that have come forth, vinisrita, that have been emitted by, that have come forth from Srimad Utpala, the Venerable Utpala, namely Utpaladeva, the author of the core text of the Pratyabhijñā corpus, whose awareness, whose enlightenment, whose Bodha, this is a Bahuvrihi as I understand it, Sri Somananda Bodha, Srimad Utpala, whose enlightenment is from Somananda. In other words, who owes his enlightenment to the teachings of his guru, Somananda. These compositions, which are Samvida Moda Sandarbha, which are compositions whose fragrance, that possess the exquisite fragrance of enlightenment, of samvid, of enlightened awareness. Samvid amoda sandarbha, spreading in all directions, dik prasarpinaha. Dik means in all 10 directions, or perhaps only in 8, since going up or down isn't much use when it comes to disseminating knowledge. Now, so supreme are the compositions that have come forth filled with enlightenment's fragrance from the Venerable Utpala when he had been awakened by the Venerable Somananda, spreading far and wide, dik prasarpinaha. And then there's a double meaning here, as so often in these Kavya-style verses. Though it be Shastra, this doesn't prevent Abhinavagupta from using literary artifice. So there's a second meaning here, which indicates a comparison through double meanings. So spreading far and wide, like, and allow the word like here, like the fragrance released by the beautiful water lily, Srimad Utpala, when it awakens in delight, Ananda Bodha, when it awakens being made joyful, Ananda Bodha, by the moon, i.e. at the touch of the rays of the moon. So let me read that again with the second meaning. Supreme are the compositions that have come forth filled with enlightenment's fragrance from the Venerable Utpala when he had been awakened by the Venerable Somananda, spreading far and wide like the fragrance released by the beautiful water lily when it awakes in delight at the touch of the rays of the moon. The second verse. Tada swada bharavesha bringhitam mati shatpadim Gurur Lakshmanaguptasya Nada Sammohinim Numaha. Numaha, I praise. Of course, it's literally we praise, but by the conventions of the etiquette of Shastra, the plural is used in the inclusive sense. It's a polite I, not a royal plural. I praise, Numaha, Naomi, in other words, the intellect, Mati Shatpadim, literally the intellect be. There's another metaphor coming in. The intellect of my teacher Lakshmanagupta. Gurur Lakshmanaguptasya Mati Shatpadim Namaha. I praise the be, which is the intellect of my teacher Lakshmanagupta, which entrances Sammohinim, which intoxicates or entrances Sammohinim, makes me confused, puts me into an ecstasy, Sammohinim, with the nada, the inarticulate or deep resonance, humming, nada Sammohinim, of its understanding, like a bee within that lily, roused by immersion in the full relish of its fragrance. Tada swada bharavesha bringhitam mati shatpadim. Literally, I praise that bee of the intellect of my guru, Lakshmanagupta, which has been nourished, bringhitam, nourished, strengthened, by avesha, immersion, in the intensity, bara, of relishing that, tadaswada, that wonderful fragrance emitted by the lotus, which is the water lily, which is Utpaladeva's enlightened state. And I take this attribute nada sammohinim as in Shastra we would call a hetau visheshanam, an attribute which explains a reason. So in my translation I therefore allowed myself a new sentence here. For that in turn now entrances me with a deep resonance of its understanding, of its knowledge, its understanding. Like a bee within that lily, this is the convention of poetry, the bee is trapped inside the lily, you hear it buzzing, roused by its immersion in the full relish of that fragrance. Now the first of these two verses pays tribute to Utpaladeva, disciple of Somananda, as the author of the principal philosophical texts of the Pratyabhijñā doctrine, and you have those on your handout. On page 3, item 5, towards the bottom of that page. Let me just quickly tell you what those texts are. The root text is the Ishvara Pratyabhijñā Karika, the root verses on the recognition of self as the deity. Ishvara Pratyabhijñā Karika, which means not contracting the deity to the dimensions of one's own ego, but the other way round. Recognition that what you cling to as yourself is an epiphenomenon, that its true core is this omnipotent, totally creative force, which is Shiva, or Bhairava. So Karika means the root verses, or the expository verses of the recognition of God, Ishvara Pratyabhijñā Karika, sometimes simply called Ishvara Pratyabhijñā Sutram, Sutrani, the sutras of Ishvara Pratyabhijñā. Now on this root text in verse, Utpaladeva wrote two commentaries. One a straightforward vritti, which is a kind of paraphrase, an explanatory prose exposition of what is contained in those verses. And the other a much more elaborate commentary, Vivriti is the third item on that handout. Ishvara Pratyabhijñā Karika Vivriti, which sadly has been largely lost. We have a couple of fragmentary manuscripts, parts of it, and some serious work in recent years has been done by a pupil of mine to identify fragments or parts that have been lifted from this commentary found in marginalia in manuscripts of the works that do survive. So that project is ongoing, and I think in due course we'll find more fragments of it, and they turn out to be extremely interesting. They contain arguments which are not found in the Karika or in the Karika Vritti. And on those two works, on the first and the third, we have commentaries by Abhinavagupta. The Ishvara Pratyabhijñā Vimarshani is a commentary directly on the Karikas. And then we have his Vivriti Vimarshani, an enormous work which he completed in 1015 AD, the Vivriti Vimarshani. And it's sad that we don't have access to a complete manuscript of the Vivriti, because actually sorting out in the manuscripts of the Vivriti Vimarshani, this vast text, what is lemma and what is commentary is not easy. Because of course the scribes avoided any such useful conventions as underlining or bold characters, or you just get a text from beginning to end and good luck. Even word divisions, as you know, are not noted. Why waste space? Yeah. Which leads me to think that scribes paid for the paper, as they were. So then we have other works by Utpala. We have a commentary by him on his teacher Somananda's Shivadrishti, his Shivadrishti Vritti. And then we have three small siddhi texts, small proofs, philosophical treatises. I'll do the last first, the Ishvara Siddhi. This, in a way, is the least interesting. It's a proof of the existence of God, but there's nothing to differentiate that proof from the kind of proof that a Siddhantika would offer. In fact, Siddhantika authors have cited it for their theism. The other two are much more specific to this Pratyabhijñā tradition. The Ajada Paramatri Siddhi, proof of a sentient agent of cognition, against the Buddhists, of course. And Sambandha Siddhi, proof that there are real relations other than mere succession through causality. And again, an attack at Buddhist reductionism. Consciousness is the uniter, the creator of relations and the separator of relations. The idea that there's just a plurality of events connected by causality is seen, I think rightly, as a reductionist view, and demonstrated rather effectively in that treatise. So those are the works that are being referred to here. Now Abhinavagupta uses Utpala, the abbreviated form of Utpaladeva's name, in a play on the word of the meaning Utpala, or Utpalam. For that denotes a water lily of the genus Nymphaea, not to be confused with a lotus, though often it's referred to as the blue lotus. This is a misnomer. And in fact it seems, in my understanding of this verse, to be a nocturnal variety that opens its petals from sunset to mid-morning during the days of its flowering, releasing an intense fragrance. It's famous for the intensity of its scent. In fact, at some point, the court of Kashmir made a gift of these flowers. I don't know how they got them intact all the way to China, but they gave it to the Tang court. And there's a notice on these saying that these flowers had arrived and how amazing they were, and you could pick up the scent from several tens of paces away. So the very heady, intense scent. And that's why I think Abhinavagupta has chosen this, because the blue lotus, the lotus proper, is fragrant, but not so intensely fragrant. So that Abhinavagupta has in mind a night flowering variety is suggested by the word Soma that forms the first part of Somananda's name. For while it has other meanings, it is also one of the numerous words meaning moon. And it is moonlight that was believed to cause these flowers to open, just as It's believed that the rays of the sun open the day lotus, and indeed the day water lilies. The rays of the moon were believed to be causing the opening, the antithesis of the night blooming water lily. Yeah. So I have construed the words Sri Somananda Bodha as having two meanings, one referring to Utpala and one to the water lily, which is a comparison, an illumination of Utpala through comparison. Taking the latter, the application to the water lily, to mean when it opens in joy at the touch of the moon. He conveys that just as the rays of the moon's beams, the rays of the moon cause the nocturnal water lily to open its petals and release a penetrating fragrance that spreads in all directions, so Somananda's instruction awakened the dormant awareness of Utpala, causing it to release the fragrance of enlightened consciousness in the form of these widely disseminated works. And of course, by saying Dik Prasarpana, he's not thinking, well, they spread to every corner of the Kashmir Valley, which is about the size of the county of Kent. It's a tiny area. He is obviously referring to the fact that these texts, even in his time, had achieved considerable fame, and were, as it were, an export that Kashmirian intellectuals could be proud of. They were being studied beyond the confines of their community. They do indeed present a particularly powerful refutation of Buddhist epistemology and ontology at a time when those disciplines had reached a very high level of sophistication. And Nyaya and the other old disciplines, tied as they were to their original agenda set forth in their root texts, but didn't really have the muscle to deal with it. The Shaivas had the great advantage that they came along later and could formulate their basic principles free of the shackles of Nyaya, of the Nyaya system and the Vaisheshika system, and design their view of the self, etc., in a way that didn't fall into the trap of the naive realism of the early centuries of the Christian era, as Brahmanical thinking began to gear up and formulate its position against the heretics, as it were. I shouldn't use the word heretic, because a heretic is an insider who doesn't agree with you. These are people following other religious traditions, which were seen as posing a serious threat to the presuppositions of Brahmanical injunction. And notice that I say injunction, because that was what it was really about. The problem with Buddhism is not that it had a metaphysics that didn't correspond to the Upanishads. It's that it, by its very nature, it undermines the ability to have faith in Vedic injunction. That's the real cause of the problem, I think. It's not metaphysics so much as undermining the authority of injunction embodied in the Veda. So, this likening of a teacher's awakening his disciples' awareness to the moonlight's opening the closed petals of a night-flowering nymphea is a variant of a more common motif, that which compares this awakening to the opening of the petals of the Asian or sacred locust, the Nelumbo nocifera, when touched in the morning by the rays of the sun. We will see Abhinavagupta describing his own awakening as a disciple of Shambhunatha in these terms in verse 21 of the introduction, at the end of this preface. And Kshemaraja uses the same metaphor when acknowledging his debt to Abhinavagupta. He says in his commentary on Swachanda, Abhinavabodha ditya jyoti vikasita hrit sarojan me rasayata sarasa parimalamasara samsara vasana shantyai. You who know the rapture of awareness, relish the fragrance from the lotus of my heart that is opened wide in the light of the sun that is the enlightened consciousness of Abhinavagupta, in order that you may free yourselves forever from the influence of this worthless state of bound existence. Yeah, his devotion to Abhinavagupta is palpable, I think, in that verse. Against the hypothesis that Abhinavagupta has in mind a night-blooming variety of water lily, might be urged the fact that bees do not visit any variety of nymphea during the hours of darkness. This, I'm afraid, is a fact. Well, I'm no scientist, no biologist, no entomologist, but from what I can see from what I've read, this is seen as a fact. Bees are attracted to the nocturnal water lily during the days of its anthesis, its flowering, but only during the early hours of the morning, before they close again, not during the hours of darkness, when the only pollinators to visit them are flying beetles. Not quite so poetic. But this objection carries no weight, since the idea that bees are attracted at night to night-blooming water lilies, wrong though it is a commonplace of Sanskrit poetry. Thus a verse attributed to Bhatta Trivikrama speaks of the nymphaea flowers being invisible in the darkness, but revealed both by the buzzing of the bees drawn to them and by the fragrance they release. You can hear them and smell them. You can hear the bees revealing their presence, and you can smell them through the fragrance. And the notion that bees visit flowers during the hours of darkness is seen throughout Sanskrit poetry. It's a very common trope. And I think I've given you some examples of that on your handout. Yes, at the top of page 3, I think, here you have the notion that it is moonbeams that cause nocturnal water lilies to open their petals. That's there. And under item 4, 3 and 4, we have some further support for the underlying beliefs about flowers that make this verse mean what I think it means. I pointed out that the use of the word border, which you might think is odd for the opening of a flower, is actually well attested in Sanskrit poetry. The awakening of a flower is opening its petals. So that's a commonplace, and I've given you some references, but not actually reproduced the text. And then for the idea that the heavenly bodies, the sun and the moon, delight these flowers, and that it's the bliss of this delight that causes them to open, is also a trope of Sanskrit poetry. And I've given you some one reference there from the Mahasubhashita Sangraha, which is referring in this case to the sun, Anandayantam Aravinda Vanani, delighting the fields of lotuses. Well, I've written forest, so it's not really a forest of lotuses, it's a field of lotuses. So I think it's fairly clear that he does intend this metaphor in those terms. Now, yeah, I've just added here what I've already stated earlier, which is that indebted though Utpaladeva was to his teacher's Shivadrishti, his works have a brilliance and clarity that fully justify Abhinavagupta's making him the centre of his focus in this pair of verses. Somananda being mentioned only as the source of his understanding rather than receiving a verse of his own. No doubt Utpaladeva's works also enjoyed a far greater influence. This Abhinavagupta suggests by speaking of them here as spreading in all directions. Since Kashmir is so small, a valley approximately 84 miles in length and 20 to 25 miles in breadth, I take Abhinavagupta to be asserting that these works by his teacher's teacher had already achieved fame far beyond Kashmir's mountain barriers. In the second verse, Abhinavagupta moves on to acknowledge Lakshmanagupta, who was a disciple of Utpaladeva and the teacher with whom Abhinavagupta himself studied the Pratyabhijñā texts, as he tells us in his 2 commentaries on this literature. Tat prashishya karomi etam, tat sutra vivritim laghum, Budvabhinavagupto ham Shriman Lakshmana Guptataha. He says this in his Vimarshini. I, Abhinavagupta, Utpaladeva's pupil's pupil, will now compose this short commentary on the verses of that Ishvara Pratyabhijñā Shastra, having come to understand them from my illustrious teacher Lakshmanagupta. And another verse there, this one from the Vivriti Vimarshini. So there Abhinavagupta says, Abhinavagupta, referring to himself in the third person, pupil of a pupil of the master Utpaladeva, having received the favour of God, who caused the fullness of his innate radiance to blaze up within him, took up residence in this final physical form created by his father Narasimhagupta. and having been shown the way in the understanding of the Pratyabhijñā Shastra by Lakshmanagupta, now composes this commentary analyzing the meaning of Utpaladeva's longer commentary on this text. This is his Vivriti Vimarshani. Here he continues the metaphor begun in the preceding verse by comparing Lakshmanagupta's intellect to a bee attracted to the nymphaea by its fragrance, describing it as entrancing with its deep resonance. The word chosen by Abhinavagupta to refer to this sound is nadaha, which I have rendered deep resonance in order to accommodate both levels of reference, that to the bee and that to Lakshmanagupta's intellect. According to the meaning entries added to the classified verb list, the dhatupata, transmitted with Panini's Ashtajayi, the verb base nud, from which nada is derived, is given the meaning to make an indistinct sound. Nada avyakte shabde. Here indistinct means not articulated to express meaning. In the case of the bee, this is appropriate for its loud, low-pitched drone. In the case of the mind of Abhinavagupta, presumably this is not the sense, it serves to suggest the pre-verbal, inarticulable roar of enlightened understanding arising from the study of these works. Abhinavagupta describes Lakshmanagupta's intellect as entrancing with its deep resonance, nada sammohini. But he does not tell us whom it entranced. Perhaps Lakshmanagupta wrote a work or works, though none has reached us or been named. And he could therefore be said to have entranced the learned in general. But I suspect that the primary meaning intended here, suggested rather than expressed, is that the entranced was Abhinavagupta himself. I have translated accordingly, taking his intention to be to convey that he has inherited this tradition in an unbroken transmission. Somananda was the moon that opened the petals of the nymphaea that was Utpaladeva. The fragrance released in all directions in the form of Utpaladeva's compositions attracted the bee that was his pupil Lakshmanagupta. And finally, the resonance of Lakshmanagupta's enlightened understanding of the Pratyabhijñā has entranced Abhinavagupta, who would in due course go on to write his monumental commentaries on the Ishvara Pratyabhijñā Karika and the Ishvara Pratyabhijñā Karika Vivriti. Now, these teachers are honoured here for their philosophical works. But it should be stressed in this context that they, like Abhinavagupta himself, were committed to the Kaula tradition of observance, of worship and meditation. So I want to look at that now, rather than just leave them. We have these three philosophers who wrote these brilliant works. I want to show that these people are not philosophers as opposed to practitioners. In fact, it can be argued, it should be understood, I think, that the Pratyabhijñā corpus is seen as a practice manual of a very elevated kind. It's teaching a new path, which can almost ironically be described as easy, sugata, new but easy. Easy only because it's freed of the external props of breath control and other such mental activities or physical activities. In other words, it teaches an extremely subtle access to enlightenment through direct insight. But the structure of that insight is very closely related to principles articulated in the krama, the system of contemplating the process of cognition as revealing at its core a liberated state. So I just want to now to devote the rest of this lecture to looking at the evidence of the Kaulism of these philosophical authors. So the teachers are honoured here for their philosophical works, but it should be stressed in this context that they, like Abhinavagupta himself, were committed to the Kaula tradition. Somananda wrote a commentary on the Trishika of the Anuttara subsystem of the Kaula Trika. That work has not reached us, but Abhinavagupta makes clear both its Kaula character and his deep debt to it when he wrote his own commentary on this text. After acknowledging at the end of his Trishika Vivarana that it was his Guru Parameshwara that had established him through initiation in the reality taught in this text, he adds, Tatfanir malastiti vibhagi hridaye swayam pravishtameva Shri Somananda matam vimrishya mayani baddham idam. I have composed this work, after reflecting on Somananda's view, i.e. his view of the text. Shri Somananda matam vimrishya maya nibaddham idam. Remarkably simple line for a change. Which, partaking as it does of perfect immersion in that reality, entered my heart, it seems, of its own accord, effortlessly. That's the function of iva. Tat-tatva nirmala stiti vibhagi, partaking, vibhagi, as it does, of perfect immersion, stiti, nirmala stiti, in that reality, tat-tatva nirmala stiti vibhagi, entered my heart, hridaye pravishtam swayam eva, as though, automatically, as though without any effort. So he assimilated his teachings. He knew intuitively from the start that this was the right line to expound, along which to expound the text. But there are a number of places in the text where he appears to disagree with Somananda, and once or twice he does so rather shirtily, even, one could say. He says, well, I've never seen any text to that effect. Somananda quotes a passage, which I think is actually a Pashupata work. And Abhinavagupta, I think, must have had a fairly comprehensive library for his age. Says, sorry, can't find it in my database. There's a certain degree of distance between them. 3 generations have intervened. Things move. The convention is that nothing changes in a Guru Parampara. Each new pupil becomes an acharya in his turn and is a clone of his predecessor. But of course the reality is very different. There are significant differences between teachers and pupils, always, I think, just as there are, in successive holders of chairs in universities. It may be that we are freer to be different from our predecessors in a university, but I think even in a tradition like this, there was considerable room for individuality and originality. It just requires sophisticated exegetical devices to conceal that fact. So you have to be able to show that your innovations are not innovations, but they are innovations nonetheless, as a result of sophisticated, insightful exegesis. So, yeah, and I think I've put out something of this on your handout. Yeah. Yes. Yes, if you look at page 4, you will see something of what I'm saying. 3, 4, yeah. At the very top, Iti prakatito maya sugata esha margo navo mahagurubir uchyate sma shivadrishti shastrayata. This is at the end of the Ishvara Pratyabhijñā Karika. And in this verse, Utpadeva is saying, thus, iti, I have placed in plain view, prakatito maya, this new and easily practiced path to liberation. Sugata esha margo navaha, navo. That the great Guru Somananda has taught in his treatise Shivadrishti. So there's Utpadeva denying any novelty for himself, but he does describe it as new, this new and easy path, which was set forth by Somananda in his Shivadrishti. Now, Abhinavagupta comments on that statement as follows in his Vimarshani. Asmat parameshti bataraka Shri Somananda Padai Shivadrishti Shastriyam Abhinava Sarva Rahasya Shastrantargata San Nigudatvat Aprasiddho Pahyantara Charya Pranayamadi Klesha Prayasa Kala Virahat Sugatas Tavat Uktaha Saevatra Prakatatam Paravara Shankar Kalanka Pasaranena Nitaha. The Venerable Somananda the teacher of my teacher's teacher Utpaladeva, had already taught this path in his treatise Shivadrishti. Utpaladeva calls it new in the sense that although it was already present in all the esoteric scriptures, which term means the Kaula scriptures, it was veiled there and so not generally recognized. It was there but not seen fully. He says that it is easily practiced, sughataha, in the sense that it is free of the elements of exertion entailed by the various exercises such as breath restraint that characterize physical and mental tantric practice. He says that he has placed it in plain view, prakatito maya, in the sense that he has freed it through philosophical argumentation from obscuration by the objections raised by other schools of thought, which might stand in the way of the dawning of this liberating awareness. So it's very clear there that the function of philosophy is to facilitate enlightenment. The function is to cut out at the root false views, leaving the field open to a direct intuition of the truth that remains. And it's clear also that he considers this method to be a Kaula method. It was already there, it's in the Kaula scriptures, but our exegetes had not brought it out. And now this is the brilliance of Somananda, that he did put it in plain view. Yeah. Now, as for Utpaladeva, we know of no work by him in any Kaula tradition. But the doctrines of the Kaula Krama shine through the devotional verses of his that were redacted as the Shiva Stotravali, or sometimes called Utpala Stotravali. This is a collection of hymns on which there's a commentary by Kshemaraja. His Shiva Stotravali Vivriti. And it should be known, if not already known, by those who know something about Shaivism, that this work is a compilation. It's not the work of Utpaladeva himself. There are one or two hymns which are complete hymns, which are redacted into this collection, but it mostly consists of muktakas, isolated verses, which he composed for his daily worship, Akhnika verses for his daily worship of Shiva. And two editors gathered them together and put them into verses, sometimes incoherently. And Kshemaraja is fully aware of this and points it out from time to time. Don't blame me, blame Rama and Aditya. They redacted the verses in this way. There's certain illogicalities have arisen which the redactors didn't notice at the time. Nonetheless, the verses seem to be genuine. They are inspired by the same mentality throughout. And what we can see there is a very strong presence of the meditation tradition associated with the Krama. And I've given you some examples there. There are many more which are recognized by Kshemaraja in his commentary. So, Adhishtayaiva Vishayan ima karana vrittaya bhaktanam preshayanti tvat pujartam amritasavam. So this is one of his devotional verses, Shiva Stotravali 7.16, which means simply by occupying their objects. Adhishtayaiva Vishayan. These ima karana vrittaya, these operations of our senses, transmit to your devotees the wine of immortality with which to worship you. Simply by occupying their objects, the operations of the senses transmit to your devotees the wine of immortality for your worship. So, in his commentary, Kshemaraja brings out the evident Krama content of this statement as follows. Using the term Maharta, the great teaching. This is his preferred name for the system. This is a feature characteristic of learned exegesis in India, that everything has many names. And sometimes they're synonyms, sometimes they're not. You have to be on your guard. And do we have a pen here? Thank you very much. The Krama is known variously as the Maharta, which means the great teaching. Artha here in the sense of a teaching. Mahanaya, the great method, Mahanaya. Devi Naya, the method of the goddess. Krama Darshana, the Krama doctrine. Have I got them all? No, I'm sure I haven't. There are yet others. Kali Naya is also seen. The Kali system, Kali Naya. All these are synonymous words. Devata Naya, the way of the deities, where the deities are the senses and the faculties of perception. So it has a number of names, and the one that Kshemaraja prefers and uses most often is Mahanaya. It's also referred to as Rahasya, or Parama Rahasya, the ultimately secret doctrine. You remember last week we saw Abhinavagupta in his Gita-artha Sangraha claiming that this was the core teaching of the Gita, the 11th chapter of the Gita, when Vishnu reveals his cosmic form to Arjuna. So Maharta, the great teaching. And so this is his commentary. Ima karnavrittayopi chakshuradi devyo vishayan rupadin adishtayaiva akramyaiva shrishti raktadi devatodya kramena bhaktanam tvat pujartam antar amrita swadam preshayanti. It is by engulfing visible forms and the other sense objects that these operations of the faculties, the goddesses that are the eyes and other means of sense perception, direct within for your devotees as the means of your worship, the wine of the blissful state of liberation through the sequence of the arising of the 12 goddesses, of whom the first are Shrishti and Rakta. Actually, the editions say Raksha, but the manuscripts confirm that and other arguments can demonstrate beyond doubt that it's the first two of the 12 Kalis, who are Shrishti Kali and Rakta Kali, that he's referring to here. So he's referring here to the sequence of the 12 Kalis of the Krama's phase of the nameless, the Anakya Krama, which in the variant espoused by Abhinavagupta and Kshemaraja begins with Shrishti Kali, followed by Rakta Kali, and ends with the impressively named Mahabhairava, Ghora Chandogra Kali. Scary, terrifying, violent, etc. Kali. Such allusions are not rare in the hymns, leading Abhinavagupta to declare in his commentary, and I think you have this also on your handout, Maharta Purnasyasya Saropadesha Varshini Mani Suktani Ulasanti. Utpaladeva has fully internalized the Maharta. He is Maharta Purna, he's full of the Maharta, full to bursting with the Maharta. And so these eloquent verses of his, these Imani Suktani, manifestly pour forth Varshini, the core teachings of that system. Literally, flash forth Ulasanti, exuding, pouring forth, Varshini, Saropadesha, the core teachings, understand, of the Maharta. And in his comment on Shiva Stotravali 8.3, Maharta Mudra Mudritasya Iyam Ukti. This is the utterance, he's referring to the words of Utpaladeva, this is the utterance of one who has been stamped with the seal of the Maharta. So he's been pushed into that shape, he embodies the Maharta. Similarly, referring to the 17th hymn, he says, Shriman Maharta Sarukti Maye Mutrastutre. In that hymn, that abounds in the core teachings of the Venerable Maharta. So again and again he's underlining this connection with the Krama. So let's pause on that for a moment. We tend to see this tradition through the eyes of Abhinavagupta largely, and particularly through the eyes of the Tantrāloka. And the Tantrāloka is exegesis of a particular Tantra of the Trika, the Malini Vijayottara. He takes that as the basis for a comprehensive illumination of the Tantras. And so we assume that the Trika is at the center of everything in this tradition. But in fact, that doesn't seem to be the case. Abhinavagupta's emphasis on the Trika is, I think, slightly marginal to the mainstream of this tradition. It seems that Utpala, the young Abhinavagupta, we talked about this last week, the young Abhinavagupta, the author of the Gita-artha Sangraha and the Krama Stotra, and Kshemaraja represent the mainstream, which is that revelation is Vedadi Kramantam. It begins with the Vedas, which are the most universally valid, apply to everyone, and ends with the Krama, which is only accessible to those ready for the Saropadesha, so to speak. It's a kind of pyramidic structure. It's not saying the Veda is invalid, far from it. It's just that its injunctions can be sublated or suspended on high levels. So to give the banal example, Smriti and Shruti declare that wine should not be consumed. Alcoholic liquor should not be drunk. Sura na peya. But the Sautramani ritual of Shruti teaches the consumption of beer as an offering, which is prepared as an offering to Indra in the Sautramani sacrifice. And likewise, the Shaivas, the Śākta Śaivas, justify the consumption of wine in ritual in the same way. These are special injunctions, Vishesha Vidhis, which contradict the generally valid injunctions of the Veda. Just as in grammar, you have irregular verbs. You have general rules, and you have special rules for exceptions. So if the Sautramani can be admitted as an exception in the domain of the Veda, then why not Kala worship? Unless, of course, you can show that it's motivated by greed or lust or whatever. And sometimes one feels that would be rather easy to do. If you read the satires of Kshemendra and others, you can see that, of course, as today, there were plenty of charlatans at work in the community, conning people whose main interest was there were unattractive men getting access to women by claiming some kind of spiritual charisma. I won't dwell on that. It's, I'm afraid, a very conspicuous feature of the modern guru cults. Yeah, not all of them, of course. I don't want to say that everyone is a charlatan, far from it. But charlatans abound. They abounded then, and no doubt they abound today. Yes, so what about Lakshmanagupta then? So it's highly probable that Lakshmanagupta too was similarly engaged. And although he has been acknowledged directly by Abhinavagupta only as his guide in his study of the philosophical treatises of Utpaladeva, Jayarata is clear that Lakshmanagupta too was also an authority on the Trika. While explaining in the Tantrāloka the order in which the mantras are to be installed in the non-Kala worship of the Trika, Abhinavagupta gives two interpretations of the scriptural passage that enjoins that practice. The first he attributes to Shambhunatha. We'll see him presently, not this week, but later. The second he states without attribution. Jayarata steps in his commentary and tells us that this unattributed view is that of Lakshmanagupta. One might suspect that the attribution is merely a guess. He's quite capable of guessing and filling in gaps, often wrongly. So it might be just a guess, and that Jayarata may have reasoned that if a view on a technicality of the Trika reported by Abhinavagupta was not Shambhunatha's, then by default it had to be Lakshmanagupta's, since he was Abhinavagupta's guru in the Trayambaka lineage, which, though most famous for its philosophical works, he nonetheless saw as the domain of gurus of the Trika. But there is another place in the Tantrāloka Viveka, Jayarata's commentary on the Tantrāloka, that puts to rest this suspicion. For there Jayarata reports Lakshmanagupta's view on how a certain set of mantras should be formed, but on this occasion he differentiates it not from the view of Shambhunatha, whom he does not mention in this context, but from that of unnamed earlier authorities, the ancients, Prajya, predecessors. The matter in question is a tiresomely technical one, but I just mention it briefly so you can see the evidence. The matter in question is the correct form of the seed syllables of the 5 face mantras of the root mantra of Navatma Bhairava. There, you have it. Abhinavagupta tells us, Vaktran yasya chakalpayet, ksha ya ra la va la bijaistu deeptair bindu vibhushitai. Here he's paraphrasing the Malini Vijyottara. It means, and one should form the faces of this mantra with the seed syllables ksha, ya, ra, la and va, blazing, deeptai, and adorned with the dot, the anuswara. So this is an abbreviated quotation come paraphrase of Malanivijyottara 8:25 to 26. Now the divergence of opinion here concerns the interpretation of the word deeptai, which means on fire or blazing. Jayarata reports that Lakshmanagupta took this to mean that between each of the 5 consonants and its nasalized vowel, ksham, etc., one should insert ra. Ra is the Agni Bija, the consonant of fire. So when he says that they are blazing, this is code for add ra after the consonant. It's perfectly common usage, in fact, in tantric text to use the word in that sense. The view of the unnamed earlier authorities is that the word deeptai refers to the otherwise unmentioned vowels, which they say are inherently fiery or igneous, actually a less convincing view, namely those commonly employed for Śaiva face mantras. I needn't go further into the details, but you can see it all there, and there's even a rather elaborate note there, which I haven't deleted, which takes up the crucial question of whether, of why in the mantra shastra, the vowels a, I, U, E and O are called short, when E and O in Sanskrit are long vowels, prosodically long, but they're referred to as the 5 hrasvas. And the view of Abhinavagupta is this is not E, O, this is E, O. And he cites the view of the Samavedians, 2 schools of the Samaveda, that have in their own pronunciation system precisely these short vowels. They're allophones of a, in fact. If you want to follow the details, it's there in the footnote. If you want to explore these byways of the learned Shastric tradition, of the Ranayanias and the Satya Mugris and so forth. So, and also he notes, Abhinavagupta with his usual broad learning says, not only in the Samavedic chanting of these subsets of Samavedians, but also in Middle Indic. We have E and O. Quite right. Yes, we do. So from now on, when you recite those face mantras, do not make them prosodically long. I'd actually assumed for a long time that they were short, but actually pronounced as long. And I've heard them pronounced as long, but now we must mend our ways and pronounce E and O, not E, O. Yeah, Satya Mugri and Ranayaniya schools of the Samaveda. Yeah. Yes, he's impressive sometimes. He comes up with really obscure pieces of information. And you find yourself scratching your head and rummaging around. I mean, finding out what the Satya Mugris thought about the pronunciation of E and O is not... You won't get it on Google. Not easily, anyway. Right. Yes. Yeah. Now, this leaves the question as to whether Jayarata considered Lakshmanagupta's authority to be confined outside the Pratyabhijñā to the Tantra system of the Trika. Remember, there are 2 levels of the Abhinavagupta's Trika, a Tantra Prakriya and a Kula Prakriya. I haven't said enough about what makes a Tantra Prakriya, I think. Put simply, the Tantra Prakriya is something which is shared by all the Tantric Kalpas. They all follow the same model, basically, the same ritual procedures. What changes are variables such as the mantra, the seed syllables, the mudras, the mandalas. The software remains the same, as it were. You just change certain variables. And in this respect, the Tantra Prakriya of the Malanivijyottara is just like the Tantra Prakriya of a Siddhantika Tantra, or the Swachanda, or indeed of a Vaishnava text, such as the Pancharatrika scriptures. They're all following basically the same, using the same software, if I may use that analogy. It's just that the data input is somewhat different. So we could design a computer program which would generate us any number of Tantra Prakriyas, if you like, for worship of any deity. We just have to specify the seed syllables and so forth. And don't worry, we wouldn't have to invent new mudras each time. We could use old ones. It's not that difficult. It's quite within the range of possibility. So that's what we mean by Tantra Prakriya. Whereas the Kula Prakriya, the Kula system comes from a very different source. Seen from the Tantra Prakriya, you could say it's a condensation of the Tantra Prakriya. All kinds of features seen as unnecessary elaboration are stripped away. The emphasis is upon direct experience, sensation, and so forth. Removing elaboration and getting down to core essentials. But you can't understand the Tantra Prakriya, you can't understand the Kula Prakriya simply as a simplification of the Tantra Prakriya. It has certain unique features which come from a prehistory which has nothing to do with the Tantra Prakriya. And that prehistory is that of the Karpalika tradition, with its big emphasis upon sexuality and possession, orgiastic worship. Collective worship, orgiastic worship, and possession, which have no antecedents in the Tantra Prakriya, except in the Atimarga phase that precedes the Tantric developments, on the far left of that tradition that we see in the Soma Siddhanta of the Karpalikas. Okay? So it's not enough just to say that the Kula Prakriya is a simplified version of the Tantra Prakriya. It has very different features. Particularly, I can stress possession. When you are accepted for initiation in the Kashmirian tradition, you have to be patient for 6 days. It takes 6 days to take you through the entire procedure. And the Guru has an extra day at the end. He has a 7th day of worship to observe, which doesn't concern the initiants. They can go home at that point. So it's a very elaborate procedure, and you need a lot of patience, but you don't need empathy. You just got to sit there quietly while it's all done for you. No personal experience is obligatory. But in the Kaula system, you have to go into a possession trance. Not everyone is good at that. and so the text says you put the person into this avesha, state of possession. If they fail to get into it, you have a more vigorous method to adopt. There are various other methods to push a person into a possession trance. And if that doesn't work, upalavatyajet. He should cast them aside like a stone. It's like you're trying to hypnotize someone. Some people can't be hypnotized. So some people can't be possessed by the goddess. But once you're in this possession state, then you're supposed to actually perform the acts of initiation to yourself with your own limbs, but the idea is you're not doing it, the goddess is doing it through your body. She's taken over your body. So it's a very different world that they're living in. It parallels many of the rites that are being done in the Tantra Prakriya, but in a state of possession. So it's really quite different. So, so far, the only evidence of Lakshmanagupta's involvement in practice outside the philosophical corpus is with reference to the Tantra Prakriya of the Trika as laid out in the Malnivijyotra. He's only cited on 2 points pertaining to that. So what about the Kula Prakriya? Well, the assumption is, or at least reasonable assumption, is that the Tantra Prakriya doesn't come on its own without the Kula Prakriya, that this system is rooted in the Kaula Prakriya, in the Kula system. So it's very unlikely that he'd be an expert simply in the Tantra Prakriya without any experience of the Kula Prakriya. And I know of no explicit evidence that Lakshmanagupta, he's never cited on a point of pertaining to the Kaula worship. However, Jayarata, at some point in his commentary on the Tantrāloka, asserts that Abhinavagupta's teachers in the understanding of the Devi Panchashataka, which is one of the 2 root texts of the Krama followed in Kashmir, were the same as those from whom he received the Trika, namely Somananda and Utpaladeva. So he actually, Jayarata makes this assertion at least, but you could say that just amounts to his assuming that Lakshmanagupta would have been just like his teacher. But I think it's a fairly reasonable assumption to make. So we have a lacuna in our evidence there. We can't say very much about Lakshmanagupta. He's left no works behind. But I think it's reasonable to make the point that this lineage, although noted for its philosophical reasoning, is nonetheless a practice tradition. You couldn't be one without the other. You couldn't just be a logic chopper without actually being involved in meditative practice, and ritual practice indeed. So now I had thought I might go on to cover the next verse, but actually the timing is great. It's exactly 5 o'clock, and we can stop there. Yeah, thank you very much.